JohntheDuncan.
China ate your lunch, Joe.
You're the worst president America has ever had.
Hey,
Come
Joe,
on.
Ladies and gentlemen, leaders and fighters for freedom and liberty and the American dream.
The best is yet to come.
As we all know, there's an election going on, and as you can see, I'm staying very chill about it. Very, very chill about it. As we all know, the takes about this election have all uniformly been very, very measured. But there's two ends of the take spectrum which have both annoyed me and have relevance beyond the end of this election. So if you're watching from the far-flung future of like 3 weeks from now, keep watching, because this video deals with the underlying ideology which connects both presidential candidates and will ultimately win the election. Neoliberalism. So the two damaging perspectives which I've seen come up a few times are: 1. If Biden wins, then that's the end of the onward creep of authoritarianism in the US, and we can breathe a collective sigh of relief as politics can go back to normal. And 2, that it's fine or even good if Trump wins, because that'll really smash the neoliberal hegemony. Both of these suffer from the illusion that both candidates, or the political programs they represent at least, have fundamentally different ideologies, which they don't. Now wait, I can hear you all typing. Stop it. Before you accuse me of saying, oh, both parties are the same, so there's no point voting, I'm not saying that. Biden winning is by almost all measures better than Trump. But the reason why Trump emerged is because he's part of an ideological process which took over the entire state and economic apparatus in increasingly authoritarian ways, while fostering inequality, disengagement, and feelings of a lack of control within a population which became more and more susceptible to far-right propaganda. Biden was part of that process, and while his election would be better than Trump's, it obviously won't fix those problems. Far more is needed. So I'm not telling you how to vote, or if you should. I hope Biden wins, but it's your decision. What I am saying is that we need to understand the ideology at work, and in doing so understand the nature of the fight we're fighting, no matter who wins. So let's understand that ideology. This is really nice. This is a really good cocktail. Part 1. What is neoliberalism? There's a common mistake people make when they're talking about neoliberalism, that it's simply a bunch of policies loosely associated with so-called market fundamentalism.
I think neoliberalism is a doctrine, market fundamentalism is dead.
This perspective is quite common, particularly among economists, who, I don't know, they often seem to have little concern over ideological or sociological perspectives on this. That's right, economists, I'm coming for you. This is now a drama post. But economists. For example, in 2008, Nobel Prize winner and former chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, described neoliberalism as
that grab bag of ideas based on the fundamentalist notion that markets are self-correcting, allocate resources efficiently, and serve the public interest well. It was this market fundamentalism that underlay Thatcherism, Reaganomics, and the so-called Washington Consensus in favour of privatisation, liberalisation, and independent central banks focusing single-mindedly on inflation.
Right here is that privatisation, liberalisation or deregulation, and a concern for inflation are common policy prescriptions of neoliberalism. But that's what neoliberalism does, not what neoliberalism is. And what is wrong and actually quite damaging for how we fight neoliberalism is the idea that it's drawn from a position of pure market fundamentalism, which is generally said to mean an urge to retreat the state from the economy totally along laissez-faire lines. This is a misreading of what neoliberalism is, both in theory and in its really existing expressions. And you might say, John, do you think that you know better than a Nobel laureate and former chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. It's That's really nice. So I think the easiest way to clarify the exact nature of neoliberal ideology is to present it in opposition to classical liberalism.
What is a classical liberal? It sounds like someone who's a liberal, but perhaps a bit fancier, maybe sporting a top hat, a twirly mustache, and a monocle.
Tea time!
In classical liberal ideology, capitalism is assumed to be the natural state of the world, and the individual is seen as naturally capitalistic, which means that the state should largely just retreat and perform a night watchman role of preventing monopolies and protecting property rights. If the state steps back, then capitalism will trundle along just fine. By contrast, neoliberalism was born of a time when Keynesian and communist states were dominant in the world. So they couldn't make that assumption. Instead, neoliberalism views the free market system and the individual as a capitalist actor as something which has to actively be produced. This leads neoliberalism to centre both the state and the individual within the ideology as things which have to be remade in the neoliberal image, which crucially involves forcing individuals into becoming individualistic, entrepreneurial, capitalistic, and
personally responsible.
these are the absolutely central features of neoliberal ideology, not crude market fundamentalism or small state rhetoric. A good example of what I'm talking about would be neoliberal changes to welfare. Rather than simply removing the state from welfare, as a market fundamentalist notion would imply, neoliberalism changes welfare from just going out to the welfare office to claim your dole if you're poor or out of work with no other conditions attached, into so-called workfarism. Workfarism is a type of welfare which puts certain behavioural conditions on an individual before they can receive any state support. This often takes the form of things like mandating people seek work for 35 hours a week, or go to job coaches, or constantly be seeking more and better paid work. Failure to meet such standards results in both material punishments, like the taking away of your welfare, and psychological punishments, like branding you a failure or a scrounger. Such neoliberal welfare serves to both change the individual and to create a reserve army of labour, which is a pool of the unemployed filtering in and out of work, which serves to keep inflationary pressures on wages nice and low for the capitalists, so they don't have to pay that much. It changes both the state and the individual to both support the capitalist market systems and capital accumulation, and has historically been very harmful for the poor and unemployed. This isn't small state market fundamentalism. It takes a huge and expensive bureaucracy and constant state intervention. But the point for neoliberals isn't to shrink the state in all regards, but to use it to shape individuals' behaviour and promote capital accumulation in the market. Other examples of neoliberal state intervention for such purposes include things like using the force of the state to smash opposition to neoliberal reforms, as Thatcher did in the UK, and also to use the state to step in and prop up the market system should it fail, as happened in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. Perspectives like Chief Economist of the World Bank and Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz tend to jump the gun a bit and assume that state intervention means the end of neoliberalism, like in 2008.
Neoliberalism is a doctrine, market fundamentalism is dead. I think that's clear. I mean, I've actually remarked that this September has been to market fundamentalism what the fall of the Berlin Wall was to communism.
Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and neoliberalism is still pretty strong. Sorry, Joseph. This isn't to say that deregulation or privatisation aren't part of neoliberalism. They clearly are, but it explains why they're part of neoliberalism. Moving certain state functions into private hands and removing regulatory barriers are consistent with the goal of reshaping the state for the purposes of supporting the market system. Understanding this ideological centre of neoliberalism, not just as market fundamentalists' notions of small state governance, allows us to see more clearly how neoliberalism works, and crucially, we can see how authoritarian tendencies in neoliberalism develop. Part 2. Authoritarian neoliberalism. If we accept that the core principles of neoliberalism are not the retreat of the state, but the reshaping of the state and the individual into a specific mould, then we can see how authoritarian tendencies are embedded in the ideology. Firstly, the goal of neoliberalism is to literally force you into becoming a new type of person has some pretty obvious authoritarian dimensions. Like the state is literally trying to force you into becoming a new type of person. As Thatcher said,
economics are the method. The object is to change the soul.
Maybe the most obvious example of authoritarian neoliberalism would be the laboratory of neoliberalism, Pinochet's Chile. The state under Pinochet didn't just retreat and privatise previously nationalised businesses, but did a coup, murdered and tortured and disappeared thousands of people, all so that they could get their neoliberal reforms passed. Which I consider a pretty major state intervention. Then there's Thatcher's government, which used brutal state tactics to destroy the unions, pass anti-union legislation, and reshape the state into being even more overtly hostile to labour. I have a whole video on this, which you should watch after this one, if you're interested. Again, this isn't the state just stepping back and allowing free association, but the brutal use of state force with the goal to try and reshape the state individuals into a neoliberal mould with the purpose to further capital accumulation and support capitalist free market systems. The direct result of attacks on labour rights across the neoliberal world has meant a weakening of labour laws, weakening of collective bargaining processes, and increasingly individualised labour. The obvious result of this is a declining control of workers, that's me and you, over the conditions of our lives in the face of both increasing state power and increasing corporate power. As a result of this, there's been a worsening of conditions of workers throughout the neoliberal era, as wages have stagnated and in-work poverty has increased, which further impedes the ability of people to organise and reclaim some control. Because if you're just worried about where your next meal's going to come from, organising might take a back seat. Neoliberalism represents a project of shifting power out of the hands of most people and into a few concentrated hands, whether that's in the state or in corporations or in international and democratically unaccountable bodies like the IMF and World Bank, who increasingly control the conditions of your life. Which is just great. But wait, don't clean off your shoes yet, because we're not done stepping in shit. Neoliberalism also has a tendency to view democracy and democratic accountability with deep suspicion, as people are seen as unable to know the true functions of the economy and are thus unable to make the correct decisions about how it should be run. Such decisions should be left to elites or corporations. For example, check out this display of supercilious dickheadery from the West Wing.
It's activist vacation is what it is. Spring break for anarchist wannabes. Black t-shirts, the gas masks as fashion accessories.
Mr. Fancy Pants speechwriter free trade fan, he knows he's got all the right answers to himself, even though between you and me he's, factually wrong on many points. But the people around him, these anarchists, they don't have the right answers. It's the elites that have the right answers. So we best leave all the decisions to them.
We did repetition, we did floating opposites, and now you end with the one that's not like the others. Ready? Free trade stops wars. And that's it. Free trade stops wars. And we figure out a way to fix the rest. One world, one peace. I'm sure I've seen that on a sign somewhere.
The daddy of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek, was fairly well known for his suspicion of democracy and his defence of Pinochet's Chile and apartheid South Africa. Which, great job, man. Knocked out the park with that one. This was a function of his elevation of what he called economic liberty over what he called unlimited democracy, which he saw as just representative democracy which had too much control over the economy. That's the limit of Hayek's democratic system. Representative democracy, so long as it doesn't have too much influence on economics. Democracy. A good contemporary example of this neoliberal anti-democratic tendency is in Brazil, where with support of the IMF, the government passed a constitutional amendment which mandates a 20-year limit on growth of spending. This effectively creates 20 years of austerity, with a block on the democratic ability to reverse the decision due to it being a constitutional amendment. And of course, since then, Brazil has gained its own neoliberal authoritarian in the form of Jair Bolsonaro, the man who had COVID thrice. Sounds like the worst Bond movie around. My name's Bond. Jair. Bond. So, let's draw together some threads before we move on. Neoliberalism seeks to reshape the state and individual in ways which most effectively produce and support capitalist market systems and capital accumulation. This reshaping isn't just small state governance, but alongside privatisation and deregulation, often includes very heavy-handed state action, as happened under Thatcher's government in the UK. This has a tendency to become increasingly authoritarian, due to deliberate attacks on people's labour rights and the shifting of power from labour to capital. There's also an inbuilt tendency to view democratic control with deep suspicion. But with this in mind, let's move on to everyone's faves. This drink is my fave. It's really good. Part 3. Biden to Trump. Progressive to authoritarian neoliberalism. It would be a mistake to view the Bidens and Trumps of this world as being totally exactly the same. Instead, they represent different expressions of the same ideology. For Biden, this would take the form of progressive neoliberalism, which is a form of neoliberalism which continued with the underlying ideological project begun by Reagan and Thatcher, but threw in some socially liberal concessions and weak limitations on the full force of the ideology. In the US context, Faber describes it as
predicated in good part on an uneasy alliance between Wall Street, the Democratic Party, and many of the more mainstream organizations within new social movements working on feminism, environmentalism, multiculturalism, anti-racism, and LGBTQIA issues. This uneasy alliance revolved around an economic agenda for the deregulation of the banks and financialization of the economy, free trade agreements, a rollback of the welfare state and some environmental measures, and the projection of US military power abroad.
Years. Crucially, the Obama-Biden administration didn't roll back on the anti-unionism of the Clinton administration, and as a result, union density reached a 60-year low in 2015, alongside massive inequality and poverty. Their administration continued the use of obscure and undemocratic trade agreements and maintained the heavy use of military force in support of US economic interests. This alongside the maintenance of the poorly regulated, finance-dominated capital accumulation of Wall Street and some more traditionally authoritarian tendencies such as the mass deportations, a disregard for human rights law, and the use of a massive spy network on their own population. And I know Biden was just the cool old grandpa back then, but he has as much filth on his hands from that era as anyone. But you might think, maybe he's changed, maybe he's not quite as neoliberal these days, the Overton window's shifted. So let's look at 2020 campaign then. During this campaign, we can see his neoliberal tendencies leaking out all over the place. Yeah. And things like the Biden campaign distancing itself from Bernie Sanders, the influence of Bush-era Republicans, the Lincoln Group on the campaign, the fact they won't ban fracking, and the noises coming from the campaign that they're thinking about maybe appointing some Republicans to any Democratic administration, all of which indicates that Biden will basically govern along the lines of Obama and Bush and Clinton, basically maintaining neoliberalism. I mean, like, the most obvious indication of the authoritarian tendencies of that type of governance is the fact that Trump happened. He's here. He happened. It didn't just spring out of nowhere. He's the product of an ideological and political process. So if you come across the argument that all you need to do to stop the creeping authoritarianism of US politics is to vote Biden, remember, the vote Biden is just moving the doomsday clock back 5 minutes. It's not dealing with the existence of the fucking clock in the first place. And this, of course, leads us directly to the Donald Trump. Now, I've seen a very irritating opinion a lot that says that voting Trump, that Trump winning, not even necessarily voting for him, just him winning, would smash the neoliberal hegemony. But this isn't really what Trump has been doing. In fact, Trump's policy programme has very much built on the groundwork that was previously laid over the past 40 years and aggressively pushed neoliberalism alongside his far-right rhetoric. Some of the very first things that the Trump administration in fact did was attack labour laws. He announced a resolution to block the Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces Act, he blocked workplace safety regulations, and he launched a massive attack on the Environmental Protection Agency. He also announced massive tax cuts to benefit the wealthiest in society. Basically, he was reshaping the state to further the goals of capital accumulation. Trump's administration also rolled back on one of the major, ish pieces of financial regulation from the Obama years, the Dodd-Frank Act.
But we expect to be cutting a lot out of Dodd-Frank because, frankly, I have so many people, friends of mine, that have nice businesses. They can't borrow money. They just can't get any money because the banks just won't let them borrow because of the rules and regulations and Dodd-Frank. So we'll be talking about that here in terms of the banking industry.
You can see the features of neoliberal ideology pretty clearly at play. Again, reshaping the state to support capital accumulation and making sure there isn't as much pesky democratic accountability of the economy. That's just a small part of Trump's larger policy programme so far, but the neoliberal elements are pretty damn clear. What's interesting though is how aspects of neoliberal ideology have morphed into Trumpism's far-right rhetoric. Take for example colourblind attitudes to race. Under progressive neoliberalism there's an assumption that so long as everyone has equal access to the market, then things like race, they don't matter so much. It's meritocratic, and people like Obama symbolised this. But the flip side of this attitude is that if it's embedded into the popular psyche, and then you still see that some groups of people are still living in poverty, then it's not a hard leap to then assume that if anyone can succeed, then it's actually the fault of those who are not succeeding for their poverty. Maybe it's something innate to them. And it's not a far jump to go from that to far-right radicalisation. And indeed, we do see a lot of this from Trump supporters.
Hey, Obama got elected. Well, there's going to be a whole constituency who are now going to believe America could maybe work for them. And I thought he was going to be this great cheerleader, like saying, hey, don't be in gangs, don't do drugs. You could be what I am. You could become President of the United States. So I thought, it's going to be a good for a lot of certain constituencies. But he didn't do that.
In fact, you can see neoliberal ideology leak through much of the far-right Trump-supporting talking points. This must be a Halloween episode, so brace yourself, because I'm about to show you some ghouls.
Or do you believe in American greatness? Believe in yourself, in President Trump.
In individual and personal responsibility.
Notice the role of personal responsibility among the nationalistic Trump love, and remember the type of individual that neoliberalism seeks to create. Similarly, notice the neoliberal aspects in this incel sing-along from these Proud Boys. Spooky. That's some classic neoliberal shit right there. The veneration of the individual who's become a proper market actor. Homo economicus. The Trump administration, in both its actions and its rhetoric, has merged far-right and neoliberal ideology into a more developed authoritarian strand. His victory wouldn't smash the neoliberal hegemony. It is the neoliberal hegemony. It would simply further develop this particularly fascistic form of the ideology. In fact, some have argued that the current period of authoritarian neoliberalism under Trump is actually closer to the neoliberal vision than in the past. By understanding that the core of neoliberalism is about reshaping the state and individual rather than crude market fundamentalism, then we can see how Trumpism is neoliberalism, and in fact maybe more neoliberal than ever before. And we can look to Hayek for a grim omen of things to come should this neoliberal trend continue.
As you will understand, it is possible for a dictator to govern in a liberal way. And it is also possible for democracy to govern with a total lack of liberalism. Personally, I prefer a liberal dictator to a democratic government lacking in liberalism.
Part 4. The Shadow of Democracy. So that's America's choice right now. Only one of these men will win. The fascistic neoliberal or the milquetoast one. Whoever wins though, neoliberalism wins. And isn't that just a little bit grim? Again, stop typing your comments. Biden winning would be better and you should probably vote for him if you can. I can't see any convincing counter-argument to that. But the force of neoliberal ideology will keep pushing towards its authoritarian tendencies. And no matter who wins, we need to know the nature of the ideology at work so that we know how to organise effectively to fight against it. In a way, the fact that the only democratic choice Americans can make right now is to maintain neoliberal hegemony is the most damning sign of its authoritarian nature. It's like a computer game, where no matter what choice you're given, you have to keep doing what the game wants you to do. It's not a democracy, but the shadow of a democracy, where we can go through the motions of making these false choices so that we can cling to the illusion that we have any power while our wages stagnate, democratic control is ceded to increasingly distant and unregulated corporate control, and our rights are attacked. This system, representative democracy, capitalism, isn't democratic. It doesn't give us power, it keeps it at arm's reach away from us. So don't get stuck believing in the shadow democracy. Don't get sucked into the game. There's so much more to do. Neoliberalism wants to individualise you. Band together through compassion and mutual aid. Neoliberalism wants to destroy your labour rights. Join a union or support co-ops. Neoliberalism wants to take democratic control of your life out of your hands. Strike, protest, march in the street and take it back. We together have the power to turn this shadow democracy into a real one. Hey, well thanks for watching. I hope that didn't leave you too much of a downer. I wore a fancy shirt and I had a nice drink, so it felt more like a party than a funeral, but we'll see how that turned out. If you enjoyed it or felt like it was a party too, hit the like and comment and share it with everyone you'd like. Thanks to Ponderful, to Catherine and to We're in Hell for providing their beautiful voices to illustrate the quotes that I chose. They all have great channels that you should definitely check out and they're all linked in the description. Also a massive thanks to all my patrons who are helping me make this video and get through my PhD. And particular thanks to Paul Singleton, Tamash Kispeter, Seamus Morrison, Stephanie Beverley, Aaron, Sinan Kos and J Fraser Cartwright, and Jamtapot and Gary Dillon. If you'd like to support me too, then please just go right ahead to patreon.com/JohntheDuncan or give off a one-off donation via Ko-fi. The link is in the description. I'm probably going to finish this cocktail, maybe another one, and then maybe cry. So, cheers. It was really nice actually. It was a really good cocktail.